Hello friends, welcome back to this online lecture series on earthquake resistant design of structures. Now, as you remember, in the previous lecture, we have started with the discussion of base isolation system. In the previous lecture, we have discussed regarding the necessity of base isolation system, then the concept of base isolation, the principle on which the base isolation system is proposed, and lastly the suitability under the conditions based on which the base isolation system can be adopted. In today's lecture, we are going to discuss regarding the advantages of providing the base isolation system, the structural components of the base isolation system, seismic configuration of base isolation system, the types of base isolation system, and whether it is an economic solution to be considered or not. So, let us start with today's discussion, where first of all, let us discuss regarding the comparison between the fixed structure and the isolated structure. So when I am talking about the fixed structure and the isolated structure, then as you can see that the figure is showing that the lateral force is applied on the structure. Now two types of structures are shown. First is the structure which is having a base isolation system, and second structure is the one where the structure is fixed to the ground. Now as shown in the figure itself, it is pretty much clear that the structure that is having base isolation system is undergoing very little deformation as compared to that of the fixed system. Why? Because the amount of force or the amount of acceleration that is likely to transfer due to the ground shaking is going to be very less in case of base isolation system as compared to the fixed structure. And also the load versus displacement graph is shown, where on the first side, that is the other side, you can see the graph of the fixed structure, and on the second side you can see the one of the isolated structure. So in case of the fixed structure, you can see that almost the kind of behavior that we are expecting of the deformation shape of the column that we have in case of fixed support, same kind of behavior is obtained over here. Whereas in case of isolated structure where base isolation system is installed, then it is almost going to be a straight line where you can say that the lateral deformation is of negligible amount. So you can see how effective this particular system can be if properly installed after understanding the concept of this particular thing. Now we come to the discussion of advantages or consideration for the base seismic isolation system. That is, what are the advantages of having a seismic isolation system? The first advantage is that if the seismic isolation system is going to be provided, it is decided from the very beginning that you are going to install the base isolation system for a particular structure. Then in that case, what happens is that the isolation leads to a very simple structure with much less complexity, with much less complex seismic analysis, and at the same time the structure is going to be very much simple in nature in terms of ductile detailing also, and also the type of seismic analysis that you have to do as compared to that of the conventional structures. Then the second case is, or the second advantage is that the isolated structures are going to be more case sensitive. It is going to be more sensitive as compared to the conventional structures, and as a result of that, what is going to happen is that the structure is going to behave in a better way. And isolated structures are going to have less sensitivity when subjected to earthquake forces as compared to conventional structures. The other advantage can be there that if any minor damage is going to be there, because the amount of force that is going to be transferred is going to be very less, and due to that force that is going to be transferred, the damage is not expected. But however, if some damage is there, then also it is going to be of such quantum that immediate reoccupation of the facility can be possible. And the other thing can be said is the type of behavior of the isolator is very much predictable. So it is going to be more reliable as compared to the performance of conventional structure, wherein a particular type of behavior or particular type of damage is only going to be expected. The other thing is going to be such that since these isolators are going to be pretty much flexible in nature, the damage is not likely to be there. However, if damage is going to be there, then it is going to be pretty much at the local level, and it is going to be of such extent where immediate repairing or retrofitting of that particular junction is likely to be possible. And lastly, the two further advantages will be such that it will result in the dissipating of energy, and when the dissipating of energy will be there, then as a result of that, the strengthening of the structure or the strengthening of the structural frames by providing of shear walls and other means, moment resisting frames, columns, this can be reduced to a great extent. And lastly, when you consider the dynamic loads, then in case of dynamic loads also such as the blast load, the impact on the structure is going to be greatly reduced when base isolation system is installed, and as a result of that, the performance of the structure can be much improved in case of heavy lateral loads as well. So these are all different advantages of providing the base isolation system as compared to the conventional system. Next, we look at the basic elements of the seismic isolation system, which are the key components of the seismic isolation system. Then first is going to be a vertical component, which is going to be having the capacity of carrying the vertical load, and at the same time it should be flexible enough so that the period of the structure is elongated to some extent. Then the second characteristic, so the second key component is going to be the provision of a damper or an energy dissipation device, which is going to reduce the amount of force that is likely to be transferred from the ground to the structure above. Then the other thing is that we have to keep in mind the criteria of minimum rigidity also for service loads also. So for that also, the some particular means or some particular feature characteristic has to be provided in the structure above so that the minimum rigidity is available. And lastly, the use of steel plates, vulcanized rubber or lead plugs can also be used as an important component for the base isolation system. So now the figure here is showing the seismic configuration of the base isolation system, wherein the seismic isolator is to be installed in one of the columns. So in the first case, as you can see, the beam column joint is shown, right? In the second state, what is done is that the core is cut and around the core the steel plates are installed, right? After the installation of the steel plates, in the third case, the cutting of the existing column is shown. In the fourth case, the isolation is placed in position. In the fifth place, the grouting is to be done, and once the grouting is done, then lastly the steel plates or steel panel that you have installed have to be cut. So this is going to be entirely a sequential process, that is one by one, stage by stage, all these 6 steps have to be followed in order to achieve a suitable seismic configuration, right? Next, we discuss the important question whether this particular system that you are going to adopt, this particular system can be considered as an economic solution for the structure or not, because structure is all about economics, as we have seen and as we are well aware, right? So in case of base isolation also, this question will also always remain whether this additional cost that you have to incur due to the installation of the key components of base isolation system will help in balancing the economy, or it will increase the cost of the project, or it will reduce the cost of the project, right? So that is what we are going to discuss over here. So base isolation allows for a reduction in the structural elements of the building with less ductile retaining medium. Why? Because when the force is going to be transferred to the building is going to be less, then as a result of that, the moment of inertia of the section or the section resistance of the section required will be also less. When moment of resistance is required is less, then the size of the section is going to reduce. When the size of the section is going to be reduced, then the ductile detailing criteria is also going to reduce, and as a result of that, there will be some advantage in reinforcement also, right? Secondly, the widely held misconception worldwide is that the base isolation system is an expensive system. But here we have taken an example of a union house that was built in Auckland in 1983, where the base isolation system was installed. So it was observed when the base isolation system was involved, then as a result of that, there was a reduction of around 7% in the costing of the structure was obtained. And at the same time, the work in the, or the, you can say the speed of the project or the timeline of the project was reduced by 3 months. That is 3 months were saved in completing the finalization of the, reaching the finalization of the project, right? So the research or the study of such case studies have shown that whenever the base isolation system will be installed, then it is going to inculcate only 3% of cost, which is going to be not a major cost when you look at the overall economics of the structure that you are going to do. And at the same time, the amount of flexibility that it is introducing, and at the same time, the amount of advantages that it is bringing forward, based on that, we can say that 3% of cost is a very economic number which you can have for achieving the stability and safety of the structure. The other advantage or other point that we can discuss regarding the seismic isolation system is that the seismic isolation system device requires no maintenance during the life of the building, right? If you are going to go for any other kind of systems, retrofitting or strengthening, then in the first case, these agencies are going to be different. So as a result of that, you will have to pay an extra cost to them. Once these are installed, then they will have a limited life. So the maintenance of these things are also to be kept in mind. Whereas in case of seismic isolation system, maintenance is not required at all, and as a result of that, the maintenance cost is going to be there. Initial investment is going to be there, that is going to be 3%, right? Additional 3%. But once the initial investment is done, then the maintenance is not going to be there. And the efficiency of any system is always checked in that way, whether the investment is low and the maintenance is high, or the second thing is that the investment is high and the maintenance is almost negligible. But here, in case of seismic isolation system, we can say that it is going to be a case where the investment is also going to be very low and the maintenance is almost going to be negligible in nature, right? Then the other advantage is that following any significant event there should be happening, then immediately the inspection of bolts and plates can be done to make sure that they are in place. If there is any damage that is going to be there, in case of that is the force or the event that has taken place has introduced large amount of lateral forces that are going to be higher than the ones that are going to be calculated also. Then also the local repairing of this base isolation system can be done, and as a result of that, the retrofitting is going to be a very easy process, and no other retrofitting schemes are likely to be adopted in this particular case, right? And lastly, since the building is going to be protected from major damage, repair cost following an earthquake will be almost lower to non-existent. That is, when the global effect or the local effect, both these effects are going to be terminated due to this system that is going to be introduced, and as a result of that, the strengthening or the retrofitting cost in the large life cycle of the structure is going to be almost eliminated, and as a result of that, no consideration for this type of cost shall be included during the cost analysis of the project. And lastly, before we end today's session, we talk about the different types of base isolation systems are there. Then basically two types of system are there. First is known as the sliding system, second is known as the elastomeric system. When I talk about the sliding system, further two categories are there, where the first category is the resilient friction system and second is the friction pendulum system. And if we talk about the elastobearing system, then in case of elastobearing, you have the bearing systems where you have the natural rubber bearings, then low damping rubber bearings, the third is leak plug bearings, and last is high damping rubber bearing. Now these, as the names are suggesting, these all four different types of bearings are going to have different characteristics and different properties based on which the amount of force that is likely to be transferred from the ground to the structure can be controlled. So based on the requirement that you are going to having, if you want to damp the force to a greater extent, then you can always go for high damping rubber bearing. Or if you want to have only a limited amount of force to be transferred, then you can go for low damping rubber bearing as well, right? In the previous series, that is the structure in the subject of structural dynamics also, we have discussed several times regarding the the functions and the geometries of these bearings. That is why we are not going into the detailing of these bearings, only have listed the categories of the different bearings that are available in the market. I hope the concept of base isolation, the principle of base isolation, its seismic configuration, advantages and disadvantages, and lastly, whether it is an economic solution or not, that question is answered by today's session on this particular topic. Stay tuned for the further lecture series. Thanks for watching today's lecture. Thank you.